The summer of 2025 arrived in Ichikawa, Japan, with a particular kind of cruelty. The kind that settles into concrete and stone and does not leave by nightfall. Temperatures climbed past 37 degrees for 11 consecutive days. The air above the city sat thick and colorless, the way overheated air does, visible almost pressing down on everything beneath it. In the eastern corner of Ichikawa City's zoological and botanical garden, a small troop of Japanese macaques moved through their Rocky Mountain habitat with the slow economy of animals, conserving every calorie. 56 of them lived on that mountain. 56 animals with their own histories, their own alliances, their own particular ways of sitting in the shade. They had been there long enough to know every crevice of that rock, every feeding station, every patch of cool ground that the shadow reached at 4 in the afternoon. They knew each other the way families know each other, by sound, before sight, by smell, before either. In the middle of July, one of the younger females, a first-time mother, her body still carrying the lean tension of an animal that had never done this before, gave birth in the early hours of the morning. The infant was small even by the standards of newborn macaques, dark-furred, which was unusual. Most Japanese macaque infants arrive with coats the color of pale sand, bleaching slowly to gray as they age. This one came into the world already wearing something darker. A coat the color of a winter forest, seen from a distance. For one day, he held on. For one day, his fingers curled in the thick fur of his mother's chest. The way all macaque infants curl, the grip reflexive and absolute. The whole body organized around that single act of holding. But the heat had done something to his mother that no one could see from the outside. The 11 days of abnormal temperature, the weight of a first pregnancy, the confusion of a young animal who had watched other mothers but had never been one herself. It had used something up in her. By the morning of the second day, she had stopped. Not violently, not with any drama that the rest of the troop seemed to register. She simply set him down, walked a few meters, and did not turn back. One by one, the other females on the mountain passed him. They slowed, some of them. They looked. They moved on. The infant lay where his mother had placed him, in the shadow of a rock, his dark fur absorbing the last of the early heat. His calls growing smaller and then quieter as the morning wore on. He was less than 48 hours old. His name, when the keepers gave him one, would be Punch, borrowed from a beloved Japanese manga artist whose pen name combined the two words for his species and his craft. But that name was still hours away. In those first hours, he was simply the thing that needed to be carried inside. Keeper Shunpei Miyakoshi was 34 years old that summer. He had the unhurried quality of someone who had learned through years of this work that stillness was not the same as inaction. His colleague Kosuke Kano was 24, his first year in the profession, still carrying the particular forward-leaning energy of someone who had not yet learned when not to reach. They made the decision together, and quickly he would stay close to the sounds of his troop. They placed his small enclosure near the wall that separated him from the mountain. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that the rhythm of 56 lives could pass through stone and reach him where he slept. They began the feeding schedule that newborn macaques require small amounts every 2 hours through the night. Kano took the first overnight shift. He sat on the floor of the small room with his back against the wall and watched Punch sleep on a folded towel, and understood some time before that this was going to be different from anything he had done before. Not because of the work itself, the feeding schedule, the temperature checks, the careful observations that the work required. Those things he had been trained for. What he had not been trained for was the particular quality of an animal that's small asleep with both hands open in a room that was too quiet. He refilled the bottle at 2 in the morning and again at 4. Each time Punch gripped his finger during the feeding with the automatic completeness of a body that did not yet know there was any reason not to trust what it was touching. Kano sat with that for a while after each feeding, longer than was strictly necessary. The towel was the first problem he could do something about. Punch would grip it, hold it for a few minutes, and release. Then search again, finding nothing, settling into a shallow, restless sleep that did not look like rest. He tried a soft giraffe, left in the supply room, a stuffed animal of the sort that lines the shelves of Japanese toy stores. Punch sniffed it and turned away. Miyakoshi brought in a small bear the following morning. Then a rabbit. Then a length of fleece fabric folded into a rough cylinder. Each time Punch reached for it. Each time something in the assessment was wrong. What the infant was looking for, they gradually understood, was not softness in the general sense. It was depth. Long fiber dense enough to anchor small fingers, loose enough to disappear into, when you press your face against it, the specific physical quality of something that would not flatten under the weight of being held. The orangutan arrived, the way many things arrive in small zoos. Someone had it, someone brought it. It was the right size, and no one had a better idea. It was an IKEA Djungelskog, 36 centimeters tall, its fur a deep synthetic brown-orange, long at the surface, dense at the root. When Punch encountered it, he moved toward it without hesitation. His hands found the fur at the shoulders. His feet found purchase along the lower body. He pressed his face into the chest and went still, the specific stillness of an animal that has found what it was looking for. He did not let go. Not that evening, not through the night, not the next morning. He slept with both hands buried in the synthetic fur. His breathing, even his dark body rising and falling against something that did not breathe back. Miyakoshi noted it in his records, the way keepers note things without editorializing with the clean economy of professional language. But when he passed the doorway that night and saw the small dark shape pressed into the chest of the orange stuffed animal, he stood there longer than the note required. In the weeks that followed, the orangutan became the fixed point of Punch's small world. He carried it belly to chest, face tucked into the neck region, the same grip maintained even through sleep. When Miyakoshi lifted him for feeding, Punch's fingers tightened briefly before releasing, the way you tighten your grip on something, before letting go to reach for something else. He always returned. Every time, without apparent deliberation, back to the same position, the same grip, the same press of his face into the chest of an animal that had never existed. The orangutan began to show the evidence of being needed. The fiber at the shoulders, compressed first, packed flat by two small hands that returned to exactly the same places day after day. The color faded slightly at the chest, where Punch's breath passed most often. A seam near the left arm began to loosen, the thread thinning under the repeated tension of being held by something that had nowhere else to put its strength. If anything, the wear made it more itself, less a product, more specifically the thing that Punch had made it. By September, Punch weighed nearly a kilogram. His dark fur had grown thicker, his limbs stronger, his eyes moving with the quick tracking of a young macaque who had begun to understand that the world around him was worth watching. He had learned that Miyakoshi's footsteps, heavy and evenly spaced, meant one thing was coming. That Kano's footsteps, lighter and slightly faster, meant another. He had learned that the particular quality of morning light through the window meant the long quiet of nighttime was over. He had learned that the sound of the kettle meant something was being prepared for him, and that the specific click of the cabinet, where the feeding supplies were kept, came approximately 3 minutes before arrival. He organized his world by these sounds the way all small creatures organize the world, not by understanding it, but by reading it, by finding the patterns that could be relied on, by learning which things meant safe and which things meant wait, and which things meant nothing in particular had changed. He had learned the sound of the troop on the other side of the wall, the rise and fall of their voices, the alarm calls and the feeding sounds, and the low, constant murmur of 56 animals going about their lives 30 meters away. He listened to them every day. He could not yet join them, but he was already learning the rhythm of them, the way you learn the rhythms of a place before you are allowed inside it. In October, Miyakoshi began timing the troop's peak vocalizations against Punch's responses. When the mountain was loudest, the mid-morning feeding hour, the late afternoon social clustering before nightfall, Punch would position himself nearest the wall, not pressing against it, just near it, listening with the whole body attention of an animal storing something up. And every night, when the learning was done for the day, he returned to the orangutan, pressed his face into its faded chest, found the same grip with the same hands, breathed evenly in the dark. Some forms of love do not require a heartbeat. They require only constancy, the quality of being there, sometimes not when it is convenient, but every single time the small hands reach for something to hold. The orangutan had that. It had nothing else. But in the particular darkness of those first months, when Punch was learning whether the world could be trusted at all, it was enough. It was in fact exactly enough. Miyakoshi was still standing at the observation window when Kano arrived for the morning shift. Neither of them said anything at first. Punch was asleep against the orangutan, one hand still buried in the fur at the shoulder, his breathing steady and slow. Outside through the wall, the troop was already moving the first vocalizations of the day, carrying through stone into the small room where two men stood and watched a sleeping infant and did not speak. Kano poured water into the kettle. Miyakoshi watched the window. There was nothing to do, which was sometimes the hardest part of this work. The two men had been doing this together since late July. And by autumn, they had developed the particular fluency of people who share a responsibility they cannot hand off, the shorthand of glances and brief notes, the economy of words that forms between colleagues who have spent long hours in the same small spaces. Miyakoshi, at 34, had raised other animals. He knew the shape of this kind of attachment. He knew it required careful tending, not suppression, which was neither possible nor useful, but a particular quality of holding, like carrying something fragile that you fully intend to eventually put down. Kano, at 24, was learning this for the first time. He had entered this work with the forward-leaning energy of someone who had not yet learned when not to reach. Punch had dismantled that slowly and replaced it with something more durable. A steadiness, a capacity to be present without acting to let a difficult moment move through without feeling compelled to interrupt it. The most significant thing Punch had taught him in the end had nothing to do with anything he had studied or trained for. It was simpler than that, and harder. The most useful thing he could offer was often simply his presence, unmoving, in the same place at the same hour. Not doing, just being there. By October, Punch knew both of them before he could see them. Miyakoshi's footsteps were heavier, evenly spaced, the gait of someone who had walked these hallways for years. Kano's were lighter, slightly faster, the pace of someone who was still in small ways, in a hurry. When either set of footsteps appeared outside his door, Punch would orient toward it with the particular attention of an animal that had learned what reliable arrival sounds like. By November, he had begun approaching them, when they came in, pressing his face briefly against their legs before retreating to the orangutan. He did it with the matter-of-fact quality of an animal performing a routine, checking something off. An internal list door opens, keeper arrives, make contact, return to base. But there was nothing routine about the contact itself. It was brief, and Punch always initiated it, and it was always the same face pressed for a moment against the fabric of a trouser leg, the specific pressure of an animal registering presence, confirming that this too was still here. Kano mentioned it in his notes with a brevity that suggested he had chosen the neutral language deliberately. Miyakoshi didn't write it down at all, which meant the same thing. In December, the shape of their care began to change. They started bringing Punch physically closer to the troop sessions near the boundary wall, where he could hear them, smell them, press his small hands against the surface that separated him from them. And they started quietly, and without announcing it to each other, to create small distances in their own relationship with him. Less time in direct contact. Fewer moments of stepping in when something was difficult. More room for him to find his own way through something hard and come out the other side without having been rescued. It is the specific kind of care that looks from the outside like withholding. Miyakoshi knew the shape of it. He had done it before with other animals, and it had not gotten easier with practice. The 3 o'clock hour was where it showed most. For months, 3 in the afternoon had been the feeding hour, the time Punch associated most completely with warmth and arrival, with the smell of the two men who had become his world. Even after the bottle feeding stopped, even after solid food replaced them entirely, the 3 o'clock hour kept its weight. Punch would orient toward the door at that time with an expectancy that had long outlasted its original cause. He was no longer hungry at 3. He was waiting for something he had learned to count on. On the days when one of them came for routine checks for observations, Punch pressed against their legs with the intensity of an animal staking a claim. On the days when neither came, he would wait by the door for a while, and then find the orangutan, and then eventually redirect his attention toward the window and the sounds outside. He was adaptive. It was in many ways what had kept him alive from the beginning. But watching him learn to absorb the 3 o'clock absence was not easy for either man. January arrived, and with it the date they had been working toward. On the 19th, Punch was introduced to the mountain for the first time. He was 5.5 months old. He weighed just over 1.5 kilograms. He carried the orangutan. They opened the access gate in the morning in the low winter light. And Punch moved forward into the mountain with the specific caution of an animal entering a room that is both familiar and entirely new. He had been hearing this place for 6 months, had learned the texture of its sounds, had organized his internal landscape around it. Now, he was inside it. The sounds were different from inside. The smells were different, dense, layered, specific in the way that the smell of 56 animals living in close proximity is specific, carrying more information than could be processed all at once. Punch stood at the edge of the open gate for a moment, the orangutan held against his side, and took it in. Then he moved forward. The troop received him the way established groups receive outsiders, with the collective indifference of 56 animals that knew each other and did not yet know him. Some moved away when he came near. Some let him approach and then withdrew at the last moment, as if the final assessment had not come out in his favor. Punch moved through this with something the keepers struggled to name precisely in their notes. Not boldness, he was too careful for that. Not timidity, he came back too reliably after each withdrawal. Stubbornness was closer. An unwillingness to read rejection as a verdict. He stayed near the edges, at first the orangutan held in one arm, or dragged behind him when he needed both hands for climbing. He watched. He processed. He made small approaches and retreated from them and made them again. When things became too much, he came back to the keepers at the boundary fence, pressed briefly against it, where they stood, then turned and went back in. They let him do this. They stood at the fence for every session available, but not pulling him back, present in the specific way that presence sometimes has to be, as a fixed point that the other is free to move away from, over and over. Each time a little farther before he returned. Each time the orangutan a little further from his direct grip. Each day the gate opened again, and Punch walked through it again, and started again from wherever the previous day had left him. Macaque understood watching this, that every choice he had made since late July had been in service of exactly this moment. Not the incubator. The sounds through the wall. The 3 o'clock distances. All of it had been preparation for the sight of Punch moving away from the fence, and toward 56 strangers, carrying a battered stuffed animal and the particular stubbornness of something that did not accept closed doors. He stood at the fence and watched. He did not call Punch back. One afternoon, in early February, Kano was at the enclosure edge when Punch came running toward him, not with the easy trot of an animal going about its business, but with the specific urgency of something that had just had a difficult encounter and needed to register the presence of something safe. He reached the fence and pressed against it hard for a long moment. Kano stood still. He did not reach through. He did not speak. He was there at the boundary, which was where he was supposed to be. After perhaps a minute, Punch released the fence, turned, and walked back into the mountain. Kano stood at the fence a long time after that. He didn't write anything in his notes. There was nothing in the vocabulary of a keeper's notes for what he had just watched. The specific grief of watching something you have cared for in the most unglamorous and intimate ways, through night feedings and health checks, through the small repetitive labor of building trust, with a creature that had no reason at the beginning to trust anything. Turn away from you toward a world you cannot follow it into. He knew it was right. He stood at the fence anyway. The mountain at Ichikawa Zoo was not a large mountain. Concrete shaped to suggest rock 40 meters across 6 meters at the apex, a shallow pool at the base, trees along the edges that had been growing long enough to become real. It was also for 56 Japanese macaques, the entire world. Every ledge had a history. Every feeding station had its politics. The pool at the base reflected the sky differently in each season, and the animals had learned which parts of the rock held heat longest in winter and which carried the best shade in the months when the heat pressed down again. The dominant females had their preferred positions in the late morning sun. The flat section near the eastern face, which warmed earliest and stayed warmest longest. Younger animals circled the edges of those positions like planets, circling something they could not quite enter, waiting for the gravity to shift. Into this known and fully occupied world, in January of 2026, came one very small, very dark-furred newcomer who did not yet know any of it. He carried a synthetic orangutan. From the boundary fence, Miyakoshi could see the whole mountain at once. He had stood at this fence for years, watching the troop go about its day. And he knew each of the 56 animals well enough to read their moods by posture, to predict their movements by the way they held their heads. What he was watching now was different. He was watching the mountain try to figure out what to do with Punch. He was watching Punch try to figure out what to do with the mountain. And for the first time in years, watching this fence felt personal in a way he did not entirely know what to do with. He moved through those first days the way all strangers move through established places, carefully reading the room, finding the edges, before testing the center. He tried the same animal twice, 3 times, at different angles, at different times of day, with the systematic patience of a creature that had decided rejection was not the same as refusal. Sometimes it worked. More often it didn't, and he came away with the specific chastened posture of an animal that had tried something and been answered. Shoulders held slightly in steps, a little more considered. He learned anyway. He was learning a different language now, from the one he had learned through the wall, not the abstract sounds of the troop, but the grammar of being among them. Where to place his eyes when approaching an older animal, how long to hold a position before it became a challenge. The precise angle of head dip that meant something like, "I'm not asking for much." He still carried the orangutan. In the first weeks, it went everywhere with him, tucked under one arm when he moved, gripped between both hands. When he stopped, returned to with the same reflexive quality as in those first months in the small room. The troop investigated it with the neutral thoroughness of animals assessing something unfamiliar. They sniffed it. Some touched it briefly and moved on. None of them made anything of it after that. It was neither food nor threat. It was simply the thing the small, dark newcomer carried. And then there was Momo-chan. She was not among the most prominent animals on the mountain. Middle of the hierarchy, a young adult navigated enough of the social terrain to be established without being visible. What distinguished her from the others, in relation to Punch, was simply that she was the first to choose him. Not because he had positioned himself well. Not because he had waited patiently in her orbit. She came toward him one afternoon in late January, crossed the distance at her own pace, and settled near him. Punch did not move toward her. He held his position and let her come, a stillness that carried its own kind of awareness, the awareness of an animal that had learned something about the difference between pursuing and being found. She groomed him. Her fingers moved through his dark fur with the easy thoroughness of an animal that has done this 1,000 times with others and has decided for reasons entirely her own to do it now with him. Punch went still under her hands, not the tense stillness of an animal bracing for something uncertain. The other kind, the stillness of something that has arrived somewhere it was trying to get. He sat with his eyes half closed and his shoulders dropped and let her work, and the orangutan lay 2 feet away on the concrete, untouched. It happened again the next day, and the day after. Momo-chan appeared near him with an increasing regularity, and each time she came, he became slightly more the animal she was approaching, and slightly less the animal who had arrived on the mountain in January, not knowing where to put his eyes. On the afternoons she came, Punch sometimes set the orangutan down before she arrived, as if he had made a calculation, without being entirely aware of making it. Not far within sight, within reach, but down. He sat beside her and let her hands move through his dark fur and did not reach for it. There were still hard days. Days when the mountain's shifting social weight fell against him, when older males moved through a space and the whole landscape around them rearranged in response. And Punch was not yet part of the consensus about where rearrangement left things. Days when he arrived at the feeding station a moment too late and found the edge of the cluster rather than the inside of it, and had to work out again whether to wait or to try another approach or to come back later. Days when the accumulated effort of reading a social world this large and this old, with its 10 years of settled relationships and its long institutional memory of who owed what to whom, when all of that pressed down in his posture and the slightly hunched set of his shoulders and the way his eyes moved with a little more caution than usual. On those days, the orangutan was always nearby. On those days, he found it. He pressed his face into its fur, softer now than new. The bright orange long gone to something between brown and gray. The pile flattened in the places that had been held the most. Different than the chest he had pressed his face into in that first dark room. Not diminished. Just marked in the specific way that things get marked by being needed over a long time. He was still for a while, and then he got up and tried again. He always got up and tried again. By March, Macaque watched him playing with 3 juvenile macaques in the lower section of the mountain. Not the cautious contingent contact of the first week's actual running, actual tumbling, the physical abandon of a young animal that feels in this moment safe enough to be unguarded. The orangutan was at the far end of the mountain. Punch had no idea where it was. He was too busy running. Kano kept the orangutan. When the question eventually came up, his answer was immediate and brief. You didn't throw away the thing that kept him alive. Macaque agreed without elaborating. Both of them had the kind of feelings about it that don't require elaboration. By April, the mountain had largely absorbed Punch, the way mountains absorb things that persist long enough, not dramatically, but thoroughly. He was not prominent. He was a young male at the lower end of a complex hierarchy, still growing into the body and the competence that would eventually determine where in that hierarchy he would settle. But he was there. He moved through the mountain with the ease of an animal that belongs to a place not performing it, not negotiating it fresh each morning, but carrying it in the way he set his feet on the rock and the way his eyes moved through the group without the constant vigilance of an outsider. Momo-chan still appeared near him regularly. The 3 juvenile macaques from March now came to him rather than waiting to be approached. One of the older females, high-ranking unhurried, the kind of animal who had nothing to prove to anyone, had let him sit within a meter of her on several occasions without displacing him. She had not groomed him. She had simply not moved away. On the mountain, that is a kind of sentence. Today, the mountain holds 57 animals. Some days, visitors looking for the small, dark-furred macaque cannot find him right away. They scan the mountain and see a troop going about its business and cannot pick out which one is the newcomer, which one arrived in January, carrying a stuffed animal, which one spent 6 months learning the sounds of this place before he was allowed inside it. They have to look for the particular way he moves, cautious, but not hesitant, quicker to recover from a correction than you might expect sometimes, sitting at the high point of the mountain for a few minutes before an older animal arrives and his calculus shifts. They have to look for the one that is still learning. The orangutan is somewhere on the mountain most days. Faded, compacted the seam along the left arm, repaired with a thread that doesn't quite match a small practical scar that neither keeper drew attention to, but both noticed. It sits where it sits. Some mornings Punch finds it and holds it for a while, pressing his face into the thinned fabric of the chest with the same automaticity as always, the same grip in the same place. Some mornings he doesn't. He woke this morning on the mountain among his troop in the low-angled pale light that April brings to that part of Japan, the kind of light that does something gentle to the texture of stone, that finds the warmth in concrete before the air has caught up. He ran along the lower section with 2 juvenile macaques who had started initiating contact with him in March and had not stopped. He was corrected by an older male near the feeding station and sat for a moment in the particular posture of an animal absorbing something and then got up. He found Momo-chan near the eastern ledge, the warm ledge, the one the dominant females preferred, and sat just outside the edge of their cluster, near enough that his presence registered far enough that it did not require a response. He climbed to the high point of the mountain in the late morning and stayed there for 4 minutes before an older animal's approach shifted his calculation and he came back down. The orangutan sat in its corner. Through all of this, patient in the particular way of things that have already done their most important work and are simply present now, not needed in every moment, not forgotten either, just there. Punch did not look for it this morning. This morning, he didn't need to. He is 8 months old. He is not finished becoming what he will be. But somewhere between the infant who pressed his face into synthetic fur in a dark room, because there was nothing else to hold, and the animal who ran across the mountain this morning without looking back, somewhere in that distance, something was built that did not exist before. It was built in the dark and in the early hours, and at a fence where 2 men stood and did not call him back. It was built by one small macaque who sat near him and put her hands in his fur for reasons that remain entirely her own. It is not finished. It is enough.